Hello, everyone. I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for another 30-minute skills. For those joining us for the first time, welcome. These monthly lessons are a quick and efficient way to hone your reporting skills and build on your First Amendment knowledge. But they're also more than that. They're a way for you to reconnect with a community of journalists, researchers, attorneys, and academics who regularly attend these lessons. To everyone, please use the chat to introduce yourself, showcase your own work, and connect with others. Also, make sure you register for our upcoming lessons. Registration links can be found at nefac.org. As a reminder, previous 30-minute skills are available at nefac.org and on our YouTube channel, 5 Freedoms. Lessons there include data cleaning, privacy law, Microsoft Excel basics, and how to diversify sources, among many other topics. Today's presentation is focused on election coverage, and it's supported in part by the estate of Gloria L. Negri. Gloria was a trailblazing journalist at the Boston Globe for more than 50 years. And this program is part of her legacy of newsroom education and her lifelong commitment to local journalism. You can learn more about Gloria and other NEFAC supporters at nefac.org/supporters. We have a lot to cover, not a lot of time, so let's get started. Emma, all yours.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. I'm Emma Platoff. I'm a political enterprise reporter at the Boston Globe. I have been covering politics, both policy and elections for most of my career, so about 7 years full-time now, and almost 4 at the Globe. And so I wanted to talk about just sort of how I think through elections, and I hope that all of this can apply to anything from, at the top of the ticket if you're covering the presidential race this fall in your region, to state house races, legislative contests, and local elections as well. So just to start, I sort of think about election coverage in these 2 big buckets, right? One is the question of who are these candidates? What do they stand for? What kind of policies can we expect from them? What is their biography? Where do they live? What's their political experience? And the other question is just kind of like this horse race issue, right? Like, who's going to win? Like, who should I take seriously? What's worth paying attention to? And I think that there are election stories in both of those categories that add a lot of value. I think, one of the best things we can do as local reporters is just tell our communities, like, who are these people who are running and what would they do and what distinguishes them? I think voter guides add a lot. But I personally, the stories that I love to do that light me up the most try to address both of those questions, right? So you can tell me a little bit about who's running, where do they stand on an issue that might be particularly important, and also how competitive are they in this particular region, and sort of how seriously should we take this candidacy? Okay, so thinking about how to find those stories, these are just some frameworks that are helpful for me. So the first thing I would do if I was asked to cover any election, big, small, presidential, down to, a clerk's race in your county or whatever it may be, is I want to see the results of the election last time. If it's a nonpartisan race, who performed well, what were those candidates like? What are the demographics of the district? How did the primary results compare? All of these questions. If it's a candidate who's run before, how did they do in their last election? All these kinds of questions. And I'll give some examples of how I use data in particular. And then I think, we're talking in a presidential election year, so I think a lot of us have that race on our minds. And I know that working at local papers, right, as I think many folks on this call do, we're probably thinking about both ways to cover those presidential elections in ways that are specifically relevant to our local audiences, that give them something specific that they wouldn't just get from, reading an AP story about that race. But we're also thinking about local races and how they sort of fall on the backdrop of this Trump-Harris election. So I kind of try to think both big to small and small to big, and I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by that. So how to localize a national story so that it has particular resonance for your audience. It could be something as simple as, many of us were covering or following the DNC earlier this month in Chicago. It could be as simple as, here's who spoke from Massachusetts. What does it mean that they highlighted someone like Elizabeth Warren on that stage? That's a story that's likely to resonate with people here who know her, who've met her, who are choosing whether to vote for her this year. But it also tells us something in particular about national politics, right? Like, this is a progressive voice from a reliably blue state. What does it mean to choose her to highlight? Another thought I had, I've been thinking about a lot is um, when we're talking about a presidential reelection, obviously this year is a little bit different because we have the vice president at the top of the ticket on the Democratic side. People are thinking about what has this president done for me? And I think there are really great opportunities to localize those stories through big legislative accomplishments, like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act that, President Biden has touted as one of the great achievements of his term. And I was poking around online. I'm happy to send around these links later, but the federal government provides fact sheets for every single state. How much is spent in this state? What projects are we taking on? I was telling Justin this. I was on a road trip earlier this week, driving through New Mexico, and I was so struck that there are signs all over. There's a lot of highway construction that says like, "Thanks, President Biden. Thanks to our governor for the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act," which is paying for these repairs. So something like that. Here in Mass, a big story is the Cape Cod bridges, right? Are people here aware of those efforts? Are they thanking those political leaders for that? Do they connect the two, right? Do they give President Biden for an effort, credit for an effort like that? Do they sort of credit more local leaders? Like those are things, a bridge you drive across every day could be a really good reason you have for voting for someone or voting against them. And I think often we think about these kind of big, broad policy issues, things like abortion, things like tax policy as governing voters. But I also think that there are these like intensely personal local projects that mean a lot to people. So those are just some thoughts of where to start there. And then kind of the flip side of that is going small to big, thinking about how you can elevate a story about a local race by even just adding a graph or two graphs that sort of situate it in the national political context. So a really great place to think about this, I think, is with the school board fights that we are seeing all across the nation. It's about your town, and it's about can trans kids play on sports teams? Will certain books be available in the library? It's all of that, but we can give our readers more, right, when we tell them how that fits into a national picture where we see these fights happening all across the country. A local example I've tried to think about here in a race that I'm covering on Tuesday in the U.S. Senate race in Massachusetts. There's a GOP primary on Tuesday with 3 candidates. And interestingly, only one of those candidates supports Donald Trump, right? So when I cover that story, I try to think not only about, okay, if you're a Republican or an independent voter in Massachusetts, like what do you need to know about these candidates? But also, that reflects a broader kind of debate about what is the Republican Party now? How is that different for people in New England? And I think that you can elevate your story and offer readers something a little something more when you explain to them how what's happening in your community fits into this broader picture. I should say, Justin mentioned this, but I would love to take questions throughout. So if anyone wants to interrupt me at any point, would love to hear from you guys, and also at the end. I thought I would talk through an example of a story I recently did. This was in Wisconsin, but it is a formula that I promise works anywhere. We're thinking, okay, it's a big election year, right? Swing states, what do we want to focus on? What is the right sort of issue to drill down in? So as I said, I started by looking at the data. I knew we were sending colleagues all over the country. I was lucky enough to draw Wisconsin, which is wonderful in summer, if you've never been. And we're thinking about what is the right story to tell from there in particular, and where is the right place to go, right? So on the left side of the screen here, this is just a Pew Research poll showing that the top policy priorities for Americans in this election, as in many elections, is the economy. We know that for a lot of people, that is just like the everyday cost of living, housing, groceries, gas prices, those kinds of things are always on people's minds. And then, so I thought, okay, maybe we're writing about the economy in Wisconsin, right? We're trying to narrow down to find a story that's like specific enough that it speaks to readers, but is emblematic of these broader trends, right? So, okay, so we're writing about the economy. Now I'm thinking, okay, I've been to Wisconsin like twice. Like, where does it make sense to center this story in the state, like to ground it? And so I looked at on the right side of the screen. You just see this is the New York Times election results page from 2020. They just do a helpful interactive. I have that little arrow there on Sauk County, which is where I ended up going. As you can see from the list above, it's one of 2 counties in Wisconsin that flipped from Trump in 2016 to Biden in 2020. So we have a swing state, we have a swing county, and we have a broad sense that we maybe want to write about the economy. And from there, it's just a question of like, how can we focus this a little bit more to tell a specific narrow story that is indicative of these broader trends, but kind of gives readers something to cling on to. So and again, like this is something you could do anywhere. You could look at precinct level data, and I'm happy to help folks sort of find in wherever your local region may be, like how to break that out. I have an example later of how it looks in Massachusetts. So I spent a couple days kind of letting the story come organically. And eventually I landed on this discount grocery store in Reedsburg, Wisconsin, which is in this swing county, Sauk County. And I just spent a couple days. A lot of people in town had told me, like, this place is a lifeline for us. I spent many, many sunny hours in the parking lot, just kind of talking to people as they went in and out. And the reason I think this story resonated is that first of all, we're introducing Globe readers to people they don't know in a place they may never have been. But the thing that I am proud of here is we're talking about these really broad themes of like the day-to-day cost of living, but doing it in a really specific way that tells a specific story of a specific place and gives readers something to hold on to, and sort of center on. So in this case, it was this store, but it might be, it could be a food pantry, it could be a gas station, it could be a person. So I just try to think about, we start broad, we start with these big questions, and we kind of try to narrow down until there is a really specific story that tells us something special. So I think that's just sort of a way that I've tried to apply this formula in my own work. Okay, so we talked sort of about how you might think about what stories you want to tell.
Excuse me if I could cut in for just a moment. One quick question before you continue. Where's the best place to find the kind of data that you're referring to, like where infrastructure money is going?
Oh, great question. Okay, so I've referred to a bunch of different things, and I'm happy to like send around links at the end. When we're thinking about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, this is all available on the White House website. They have like state-specific fact sheets, which I have found to be super useful. And I don't know if I have that specifically linked to the presentation, but I can certainly find that. And then I think the other things I've pointed to are just election results. And those are available sort of in different websites on depending on where you are, but also like very happy to help folks track those down. And then I think the only other thing was Pew Research, which should be relatively easy to find online, and like you can always look at reliable polls like that. Okay, so thinking about, you have a story, you wrote a budget line, your editor's excited about it, now you have to write the thing, right? So I kind of think, when I think about election stories, I kind of think about two buckets of sources. There's kind of like the scaffolding sources. You're trying to figure out like, what is the big picture here? Like, what is the trend line? And so I thought I'd start there. Really, generally pretty easy, low-hanging fruit is to talk to political science professors, to political historians, to issue area policy experts. You can usually find them at a university. The press people at local colleges are often very helpful. The strength of talking to people like this is like they're reliable. You can usually get them on the phone, and you can trust the accuracy and the expertise of what they're saying. I think a step beyond that, depending on sort of your time and access and ability, is to talk to people who actually work directly on campaigns. So sometimes you may get hesitation from, wouldn't we all love to be talking every day to Jen O'Malley Dillon, who's running the Harris campaign? That may be hard to do, right? But you can look to former campaign directors, previous candidates. One thing I love to do when I'm covering elections is to talk to, like if you're writing about an incumbent, talk to the person they beat 4 years ago. Like that person can give you something, can always offer a really rich perspective. And they also have like a very practical, reliable, on the ground sense of how do you win a race for Congress or for city council or whatever it may be. And then finally, use data so that you can write with authority without having to lean on other people and quote, you don't have to quote someone saying, this is a hard, a stronghold Republican district, right? You can write with authority if you look at the data that kind of underpins the story you're writing. So I have some examples on the next slide of how I think about this. So one of the races I'm covering currently is a US Senate race in Massachusetts. Elizabeth Warren is running for re-election. So on the right side of the screen, this is from the FEC. I have the link here. So the FEC is going to have this data for all federal elections, but there is a state version of this website for any race you may be covering there. And I'm looking to see just on the baseline, right? The immediate thing you can see, we have Elizabeth Warren here in the top row and her 3 Republican challengers below, is that Elizabeth Warren has way more money than any of these people, right? So I don't think that's the whole story, but I think that that's an important thing to know going into the story. It's one more factor to understand that, she has an advantage going into this race, that this is a real challenge for Republicans to think through how they could maybe topple this incumbent. So finance is always a good thing to start with. And then on the left side of the screen, I have, this is from the Secretary of State's office in Massachusetts. They do a really good job of breaking election results down by county. And there will be a version of this for whatever region you're covering. And often you can find like precinct level data as well. In Boston, I found that to be really helpful, and I'd be happy to help anyone track that down if you're having trouble. But so the data I have on the screen here is actually from Warren's run for president in 2020. This is sort of the last time she faced a competitive Democratic primary in Massachusetts. And the reason I think this is interesting is you can see I've sorted this by the counties where she performed the best. So you can see she does well in Hampshire County, she does well in Franklin County, so out in Western Mass. These are also Middlesex and Suffolk, that's Boston and some of the Boston suburbs. You can get a sense of, okay, where is she most popular? Where is she drawing most of her votes? And as you think about, okay, I know I need to write a story about Elizabeth Warren's reelection, like where do I want to do it, right? Which voters are most important to talk to? I find these can be really helpful guides. Like, okay, I want to talk to people about why they like Elizabeth Warren. Maybe Middlesex County, Cambridge, Somerville is going to be a good place for me to start. Or I want to look, lower on this list, places where she may be weaker. She didn't do so well there. Maybe that's a place where Republicans have a better chance of picking up votes, those kinds of questions. So these can be guides to help you. I find with election coverage, like the challenge often is narrowing down where to ground a story and to center it and to make it like specific enough for your audience. Okay, so we talked about sort of like the framework for a story, the scaffolding. So that Elizabeth Warren has this cash advantage, she's pretty strong in these parts of the state. She beat her Republican opponent in 2018 by 24%, which you could find on the election results website. Now you want to talk to voters who add color and sparkle to the story and give you a sense of like how real people are reacting to this race. So I wrote here, getting beyond the diner cliches. I think that often we think about kind of shallow election reporting where people are sort of like treated as tokens and they're not taken seriously. Their concerns aren't thought about a lot. I think talking to voters is basically the most important thing you can do as a politics reporter. It surprises me every single time and is just always really fascinating. But I think it's important to think about which voters you want to talk to and where you're finding them. So I've kind of broken it into 3 categories that I think about. One is the devoted fan base, right? So these are the people you're going to find at the Nikki Haley event at the Opera House in Londonderry ahead of the New Hampshire primary. You can often find like local volunteers on a candidate's website, and you could find probably their phone numbers and their email addresses. They're hosting a watch party. They're getting volunteers out to go canvassing. Donor lists, endorsements. I have a friend who has this smart idea that I will plan to steal and encourage you guys to as well, that like drive around and look for Trump signs and knock on those doors, right? If you're looking for Trump supporters. So like that's one universe of voters, right? These are people who are engaged, they know who they're voting for, and they feel very strongly about it. And I think that those are valuable voices to have. They tell you why a candidate is resonating, like what they're doing right, basically. And it's also interesting to see like what types of people like a specific person. So there's absolutely a place for that. But you just want to be careful about how you're characterizing it. Like you don't want to present Susie Q, who has a Trump sign in her yard, as someone whose vote is up for grabs. Like, you want to be clear. I try to be clear about like where I talked to a voter and how I found them, because I think it gives you like a very different sense. So kind of this middle category I think about is you want to talk sometimes to people who are generally smart, thoughtful, engaged people, but they may not be a diehard supporter of someone. They may still be thinking, but these are people who are like civically engaged, they pay attention, they're going to be relatively informed. And again, this is advice that I'm stealing from someone else, but try a city council hearing or a school board meeting. You know your community's best. You know who is respected, who are the civic leaders, even if they're not someone who's generally thought of as like a political leader specifically, like a pastor or a business owner. You know who generally is respected, and those are really important voices to highlight. And then finally, there is the kind of true random sample of voting age people, right? You're going to catch people who aren't voters, and I think that those voices can be important and useful as well in stories. I certainly, for the grocery store story I mentioned, I talked to a lot of people who didn't plan to vote, which I thought was, just as interesting as many of the people who did. Um, Parks, grocery store parking lots, large community events. Just a really practical thing is like, think about the weather. The rain is going to make this a lot harder, although, we've all had to do it, and you can make it work. Think about where you're going and where you're not going, and the voices that are not often prioritized in political coverage. One thing I did on the Wisconsin story that worked out really well was, seek organizers' approval where it feels appropriate. But I went to a park where they were handing out like free school lunches to kids in the summer, and I had a lot of success talking to parents there. If you know that you're writing about the economy and economic concerns, right, that's a great place to try. Food pantries might also be somewhere to consider. And again, just think about whether it might be best to ask for an organizer's permission, to think about like what timing is appropriate. Communities of color, we know that their voices are not as often as they should be featured in political coverage. So think about trusted messengers in those communities who would it be all right for me to show up after church on Sunday? Would it be all right for me to come to this gathering in a park? But I think that, if you don't work very hard as a political reporter, it's going to be easy to quote a lot of like white retirees. And we know that that is not representative of our electorate, right? So thinking about like prioritizing the people who may be harder to reach, maybe less politically engaged, but whose voices are so critical to telling these stories. With that, I think that was most of what I had prepared, but we have a few minutes left. I'd love to take any of your questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma. I appreciate it. These are all great tips and excellent guidance. I see your email and Twitter handle up there, so I assume it's okay for anyone to follow up with additional questions they might have.
Yeah, absolutely. Please be in touch.
All right. Well, we do have two questions, though, right now before we wrap up. And again, just a reminder to everyone joining us live, if you have any last-second questions you want to sneak in, please do so in the chat. But Emma, you mentioned one place to find potential sources and voters to talk to is the grocery store parking lot. How do you go about approaching people in the parking lot when they're often busy getting groceries, rushing to their car? How do you approach them in a way that allows them to stop and give you their time?
Great question. I had a lot of practice doing this just in the last couple weeks. First of all, you're gonna have hits and misses. Like, some people won't want to talk to you, or they'll be in a rush, and that's okay. That's reporting. In general, I find that I had more success with people on their way out than on their way in. As people are loading their cars, they're kind of standing there anyway, and if you engage them and if you're having a good conversation, that generally felt to me like a better time. Again, like weather, I can't emphasize enough, like if it's a sunny day versus if it's pouring down rain, like that's gonna affect your hit and miss rate. The other thing I found in doing this kind of man on the street reporting is I found that people were more interested in talking to, there's kind of the straightforward things, like if you can strike up a conversation with someone about, oh, is that a Bruins cap? Or, I've never tried the sandwiches here. Like, you may have more success interviewing them after you've sort of connected as a human. I also found that people were less interested in talking to me when it when it was like an explicitly political question. And I often found that people kind of turned like more to punditry, and I really wanted to hear personal anecdotes from them. So for this last story I didn't say, I'm Emma Platoff, I'm here writing about the election. I said, hey, I'm writing about grocery prices. You know, what did you buy today? Like what's on your mind about this? Like, what have you had to stop buying something that you really like because of these expenses? And like, ideally, if you're having a really good interview, you don't have to ask them, oh, are you a Democrat? Or like, are you registered? Who are you planning to vote for until, 20 minutes into the conversation? I really try to keep it focused on who are you? What is your life experience? And try to get a lot of that established and a rapport built before you get to the explicit politics questions.
It's such great advice, making it immediately personal, local, getting right to their own individual interests. Thank you for that. We only have another minute or so, but quickly, last question before we leave here. Is there anything specifically that you would recommend we all do to lay the foundation and prepare for post-election coverage?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we should all be doing. I'm trying to think. I mean, I think it's a little bit different, sort of depending on where, what sort of races you're thinking about. Um, I'm thinking about a state like New Hampshire, right, where potentially you have the state house, the balance in the state house in play. Democrats are really, really hoping to flip the chamber. It's like a very narrow margin. I would be thinking about, okay, if Democrats take the majority, if Republicans take the majority, like what are the issues that are now on the table that maybe weren't on the table before? Same on city council, right? Like I would be thinking about issues like bike lanes or liquor licenses that you are going to want to be prepared to tackle on the morning of November 6th. Like we now have a majority on the council that like is interested in this thing. So yeah, and then you have often like this nice lull between November and January to kind of get your ducks in a row before you have to start covering like the new administration of whatever it is. So I guess I would be, and this dovetails with good election reporting, as you're figuring out who are these candidates, where do they stand on issues A, B, Z, kind of keep a tally in your mind of like what coalitions are forming and like where is the Overton window shifting depending on who wins. That's sort of I think where I would try to shift my focus.
Great. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Emma, all of this was fantastic and super helpful. Really appreciate you being here. And again, a big thanks to everyone who joined us today. As a reminder, we provide these lessons as a public service to you, so please return the favor and encourage your colleagues and friends to join us each month. Like I said in the chat, we have a lot to learn from each other, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. On behalf of DFAC, thank you. Thank you for all you do, and we'll see you next month for our next 30-minute skills. Take care, everyone.